in the dark. It was a very unsatisfactory attack from the point of view of the Israelis because the handheld hollow charge weapons of the infantry played havoc with the Israeli tanks. Generally speaking, the Centurions did not catch fire when they were penetrated by handheld heat, which is in stark contrast with the Patton tanks which the Israelis had in Egypt. And so much was this true that the sick joke in the Israeli Armored Corps was that the only difference between a Ronson lighter and a Patton tank was that the Patton always lit first time. The moment, I think, is right just to spend a short time discussing the command and control of logistics, because like everything else we've discussed, it is different from ours. The system in a division in the Israeli army is that you have a repair battalion, a resupply battalion, and a medical battalion in support of the division. Each of these battalions have 3 subunits or companies, and therefore you have a capability of 9 subunits of various mixture. The way in which the Israelis command and control those logistic units in battle is to appoint 5 ex-teeth arm commanding officers, to give them each a jeep and 2 radios, and to say to them, you are in control of those 9 units, those 9 modules, and it is up to you to listen to the battle on your 2 radios, to read it, and to direct those 9 subunits where they are most needed, so that if you hear of a major disaster in the forward area, you don't send any more ammunition or petrol to them, or diesel, because they don't need it. What you do is concentrate all your medical resources and send them there. And this further iconoclasm in our system of command and control worked well for the Israelis, using reservist ex-teeth arm commanding officers as the brains to control the 9 subunits. They had some terrible problems to solve in this area. One of them was, of course, that, as I have described, the Israelis were using a tremendous amount of ammunition. And in 44% of all the tanks, the Sabre tanks in the forward area, on the first 4 days, battlefield days, 44% of them had used 62 of their 72 rounds by the close of each battlefield day. This is in stark contrast with what is taught in some of our research establishments. Of a start of 72, they'd used all but the 10 rounds they didn't need by the end of each battlefield day, and the resupply was very, very great. And this was because they had missed a lot. They had pre-selected incorrectly. They had fired several rounds into the same tank to make certain it was destroyed. They had started every morning by firing rounds into all the tanks that had been deserted on the battlefield, because they found that observation officers, gunner observation officers, had taken up residence in those tanks during the night. In addition to the resupply problem, they had a very serious medical problem to solve, and in some cases, very extensive casualties to evacuate. But I would just like to make one more point on the logistics, and that is that for the first time in battle, the Israelis had the problem of psychiatric shock. This psychiatric shock, which they'd never suffered from before, came as a result of the intensity of the battle. And it is estimated variously that some 8.3% of all battlefield casualties were psychiatric shock. It is interesting, and it brings us back, I think, to Janos Ben-Gur. It is interesting that, according to my information, there were no cases of evacuated psychiatric shock in 7th Brigade or in the 109 battery and regiments, the regiment and batteries that were in support of 7th Brigade. And this, I think, is because they had been trained, they had been prepared for the shock, they had not been collected asymmetrically, they had been brought to battle together, and they relied on each other. So the pressure mounts, if we may go back to the battle. The pressure really mounts on these forward units. Jos, in command of 5 armoured infantry battalion, has been severely wounded and has been virtually removed from the battle. And in his place, Avigdor Kalani has come forward now to coordinate the whole of this area. The pressure on leadership is very great, and Janos has come forward from the Wasset Junction to the booster to control it from here, drawn further forward by the pressure. Raful, who we saw leaving Nafak camp under pressure here, has not gone back, as we might have done, to the other side of the valley. On the contrary, he's come forward with his half-tracks to the Wasset Junction and onto the side of the Hermanite, the divisional commander. And from here, he has encouraged individual battalion commanders and crewmen, talking to them direct. I had a long conversation with his signals battalion commander, and he described how when they got up there, Raful said, "Get me that tank." And they went through the various rebros to 26 Bravo. And there is Raful talking to the commander of 26 Bravo and saying, "You are a fool. If only you go further to the right, you can look down and there are 5 tanks you can destroy from where you are." Now, this is exaggerated. It's not what we're advocating, but it is a lesson for us, I think, of forward command. As the pressures mounted, so the commanders were drawn further and further forward to support the soldiers under pressure. It took until 0100 hours to sort out the RPG-7V infantry intrusion into Rhett's battalion area. And we see the Golani Brigade, a crack infantry brigade, operating for the first time in direct support of 7 Brigade. But there was another attack at 0400 hours across the obstacle against 7 Brigade, and this was beaten off. By dawn, it was raining, the Yoreh, the first rains of the year since Easter. And the members of 7 Brigade have been fighting for 44 hours and virtually not had any sleep for 51 hours. Because the Syrian attack at 0400 had been beaten off, Janusz's aggressive instinct leads him to order Golani to sweep forward, as far forward as he can go from his tactical fire positions, his ramps. And accordingly, the 7th Battalion, the 7th Tank Battalion, works its way forward to within 500 meters of the obstacle. They encountered, for the first time, BRDM missile vehicles. And still under continuous artillery fire, they fought their way forward against enemy armor until they got within 500 meters of the tank obstacle. They were therefore able to declare to Janusz that this key area was, at least for the moment, free of actual Syrian armored vehicles. It was getting towards dusk, and Janusz Ben Gol ordered Golani to take up defensive positions for the night in this area. This order was contrary to all Golani's instincts because he so much feared the open nature of the ground and the many crossing points that there were, and desperately wanted to withdraw what was left of his battalion to the relative safety of the ramps and of the natural bottleneck between the Hermanite and the booster, even though it meant giving up this ground which could be occupied during the night by the Syrians. Eventually he prevailed in his arguments, and Janusz reluctantly agreed to the tank battalion being pulled back to those ramp positions. Now it is the morning of the 9th, and a night which has been disturbed but has allowed for resupply. A certain amount of repair has been done, but the whole brigade, 7 Brigade, is down to 34 tanks serviceable, and all of those degraded. At this point, on the morning of the 9th of October, a further commando helicopter attack occurs just here, just to the north of the Bukata crossroads. Quite unlike the previous one, which we recounted, where Johnny Netanyahu was able to go straight away and deal with it. In this case, everyone was too exhausted and too committed to do anything about it. and the commandos had the opportunity of digging themselves in on the crossroads just to the west of Bukata. They dug themselves in thoroughly, and it took an effort of will to produce anybody to go and deal with them. A number of soft-skin vehicles driving along the road reported them before they themselves were destroyed. And so János Ben Gál gets the only unit he can, which is the Brigade Recce unit, and sends them up in 3 or 4 113 APCs to deal with the commandos. But a very different situation now, where they have had time to prepare themselves, and the entire Recce force from 7th Brigade is wiped out in the process of dealing with this intrusion. At this moment, an exceedingly heavy Katyusha rocket and artillery barrage falls on the center of the brigade area, the heaviest so far since that initial hour on the 6th. And in its wake comes a reinforced 81 Brigade from the 3rd Armoured Division up at the top, across the obstacle with 100 T-62s as a battering ram, literally merciless and remorseless, coming across the obstacle and crashing into the depleted 7th Israeli Armoured Brigade. As the force builds up and the leading elements move in different directions, like this, in amongst the Israelis are forced to give ground from their ramps. It is a chaotic moment as the Centurions engage high reverse and back, some of them into each other, and as they lose tracks, and as there is great chaos in the area, they are forced further and further back from their ramps, and more development takes place, and the battalion center point moves further and further back. And gradually they are forced to look for cover behind the booster, and we see additional positions being taken up that haven't previously been occupied, but nothing like as good over the top of the high ground and behind Hermonite here. And so it develops, crushingly impossible to stop as it comes. And it looks as if it is going to break right through. And at this moment, János earns his pay because he has created a reserve force of 6 tanks, which he's positioned at Kibbutz El Rom. And these 6 tanks form, as it were, the backstop to prevent the 100 T-62s from breaking through the parallel feeder road. This position is just tenable and holdable, and then the Israelis bring in artillery. 23 batteries of guns, including Katyusha rockets, which they have captured and turned round quickly to be used by the Israelis. The Israeli Air Force, for the first time, comes into operation. It appears that they have solved the worst of their problems with the SAMs, perhaps with American help, though I've never been able to get anyone to agree entirely on this. Certainly, Phantoms are committed for the first time, and there is a dogfight as well overhead, and we see MiGs and Sukhois crashing into the ground, and their pilots just escaping as the aircraft goes straight into the deck. The fire pours down into this area. And in addition, we see the wings of the Israeli position beginning to turn in on the assault as it comes in. And we get a hand-to-hand fight by tanks in which 7 Brigade units are firing back on themselves as well as forward. And in cases where the tanks are so close that they have to back away from each other to traverse to fire at each other. It is extremely ferocious, remarkably brave and consistent on both sides, and very, very damaging. And the consequence of this battle is that 70 of the 100 Syrian T-62s that come into this killing zone, 70 are either destroyed or disabled in this killing zone, and 30 eventually turn round and go back. And we see cases, and to this day they're still in position, of tanks that had even got as far as the shoulder here before being stopped by 105 rounds through their frontal armor. And so the Syrians withdraw from this, their last, as it turns out, their last major effort. And a vacuum is created as they withdraw. And the extreme test now comes whether the Israelis can muster the will to reclaim their tactical fire positions and their ramps. And the whole lot falls upon Avigdor Kalani. I have talked about him many times but never really introduced him to you. And we have no pictures of him except after the battle, so I'm reluctant to show him to you yet. But he is a Sephardic Jew, he is a Yemenite, he's a little tiger, extraordinarily talented, and has proved this in previous battles. And now the whole command and control weight falls upon him as he tries to persuade exhausted and disheartened and degraded crews to reclaim the vital ground in their area. And his job is made more complicated by the fact that many of them are not on his net because he has gathered people in from Retz's battalion and from what's left of Yair's battalion. He has great difficulty in getting them all onto his net. He appeals to Janusz, the brigade commander, to help him to bring them all onto the same frequency. He urges those who are on his frequency to conform to him. He himself leads the fight back over the ramps into this holocaust. And he says to them all, look, I'm flying a conspicuous flag on my tank. Rally to me. I urge you to rally. And by a sheer force of will, he leads the elements back over the reverse slopes, over the top, where they see still masses of Syrian tanks, some of which have not turned round, and they gradually force their way back to reclaim the high ground which they were obliged to leave. It is a manifest example of the single willpower of one man manifesting itself in a collection of soldiers. And he succeeds in reclaiming the ground which they have lost. So it is PM on the 9th of October, and 7th Brigade have virtually ceased to exist. The total serviceable tank force is down to 9, and one battalion, the battalion nearest to Konaitra, is down to no ammunition at all, and they are ordered to leave their tanks with hand grenades in their pockets. Janusz urges Raful that he can no longer keep control of the 7th Brigade area. And Raful, in again one of those sort of mystical urgings, says, I want you to hold for another 30 minutes, however thinly. At this moment, as so often I seem to have said, at this moment, a man called Yossi ben Hanan, a retired lieutenant colonel, who was on honeymoon in the Himalayas when he heard about the fighting and had worked his way back as quickly as possible to the battle area, having come up from Tel Aviv and having collected on his way some crews that he knew of or that were being freed from hospital, together with 11 tanks which he had got from various depots on the way up, arrives on the 7th Brigade scene. And with his 11 and the 9 serviceable tanks left, the force becomes once again a reasonable one of 20 tanks. Yossi ben Hanan and Avigdor Kalani, working together with these 20 tanks, makes one final effort to push down from the ramps towards the obstacle. And the Syrian divisional commander, having exhausted everything in this final push which failed, cracks under the pressure and orders the division to call off its attacks. And as he does so, and the final tanks withdraw across the disengagement line, so Israeli observers who have remained in the strong point at this little village here, which we think of as A3, a strong point, observe the echelon vehicles of the 3rd Armoured and the 7th Mech Division turning round on the road to Damascus and withdrawing to Sassa. The Soviets are allowed into the bunker at Katana for the first time during the whole battle, and they take one look at the situation, even as reported by the Syrian commanders, and they brusquely and very disappointedly, because their equipment has been made a fool of once again, brusquely suggest to the divisional commander and to General Klass that he should withdraw his troops to Sassa across no man's land, which they proceed to do immediately. And after 81 hours of fighting, this particular part of the battle is over. General Rafou Letan, slow of speech, the parachutist of great experience, himself very exhausted, in a slow and laconic delivery, gives his orders for the counterattack to be mounted 18 hours later in this area, and an unbelieving 7th Brigade hear the orders and do their best to take them seriously. And indeed, as we know, almost to the moment, 18 hours later, the brigade crosses the disengagement line, which the Syrians have not protected, and leads the counterattack of 7th Brigade, coordinated with reinforcement divisions in the south, against the Syrians across the disengagement line. There is no doubt that there are two main heroes that you can identify in this 7th Brigade epic, though of course every single soldier has fought like a hero. They are, on the one hand, the Ashkenazi Jew, Janusz ben Gol, Avigdor Janusz ben Gol, and on the other, as we see in this picture, talking together, the Sephardic Jew from the Yemen, Avigdor Kalani. They have fought well together, sinking their differences of culture, which manifest themselves in Israeli life in peace, and have operated in a remarkable way together in their command and control. And I have looked forward to introducing Kalani to you. He has been, as it were, staring at you over my shoulder all the time, because here he is, Avigdor Kalani, having commanded his tank as well as his tank battalion throughout the battle, having, by my counting, a modest counting, I think, been personally responsible for about 14 Syrian tanks, maybe more, from his own tank gun. His driver, and this is, by the way, after 2 hours of sleep after the battle, before this photograph was taken, his driver looks relatively fresh, having kipped in the front seat from time to time, albeit somewhat disturbed. But the gunner, who has really been on duty the whole time, looks as if his eyes will never quite go back from their stalks again. And the loader, the long-armed loader, certainly looks absolutely knackered. Those of you who have any experience of Centurions will know that the crew of a Centurion is 4, and here we show a 5-man crew. It is true. Throughout the battle there have been 5 men in Kalani's tank, the 5th being his battalion ops officer, Gidi, here, who has been perched in the back of the turret, operating the rear link throughout to Janusz, so that Kalani could spend all his effort and concentration on the forward net. And together they have typified an outstanding Israeli tank crew in this battle. Statistics and conclusions. The Syrian divisions had fought courageously and well, and if we try to write them off as having done otherwise, I believe we do no service to the truth. President Herzog, the leading historian on this battle, describes the Syrian soldiers as having been inflexibly stubborn, and I think that's about right. Unfortunately, the divisions were not well coordinated by the absentee corps commander, Tlas. And he, far from reinforcing success, endorsed failure. It's a comfort to know that one of the reasons why he did it was that he was slavishly trying to follow Soviet doctrine about SAM missiles. The Syrians were steadily using up their stock throughout the battle, and in the end, 3,500 killed and wounded, only the officers being buried, which is bad for morale, and 400 prisoners of war. You'll remember that they started with 1,400 tanks, and subsequently a few Jordanian and Iraqi tanks were added, but they left on the battlefield when they withdrew 1,180. Of those, 867 were repairable, and of those, the Israeli army converted the T-54-55s to take the 105 British gun and kept the remaining 300-odd T-62s with their very smart 115 smoothbore gun. I remember asking one of the logistic generals how they could afford to do this because they had no ammunition. And he answered in that, again, rather iconoclastic way they have, we've got enough to train just, and we'll capture the ammunition we need in the first few days of the next war. And although one laughs rather at that, it is in fact exactly what happened in the Peace for Galilee operation in '82. As far as the Israelis are concerned, it is an encouragement to us, I think, that they started very badly balanced. And they then were extraordinarily bruised by the artillery which they sustained. Their leadership was, as has been so in all their battles since '48, of a remarkably high order. And the more intense the fighting, the more forward the commanders became. Now, I'm not advocating anything in this historical review, but I am bound to say that I think we should take this lesson very seriously. It is a stark contrast with our own approach, which I myself have practiced as a regimental commander in Germany, of being in a smooth command vehicle with elaborate maps and chinagraphs. And it is much closer to what I know from personal experience to be more effective, which is commanding from one's tank and commanding well forward. We see this leadership very strongly demonstrated in this battle, with, if you remember, the divisional commander as far forward as the Hermonite, and the brigade commander as far forward as the booster. Maybe overdoing it, but there's a lesson for us here, I believe. There's another lesson that comes out of the leadership in this battle, I think, which is the determination to strike first. And we see this very clearly in the Yoni Netanyahu treatment of the commandos when they landed at Kfar Nafak. And we also see it very clearly in Ori Orr's attitude when 79 Brigade came straight up and into battle without pause. So often that determination to strike first throws the enemy. Another attitude in the command and control of the battle that I would like to stress in this summary is the sheer will to dominate. And we see this very clearly demonstrated when Avigdor Kalani had to bind together the very badly bruised elements that he had left at the end of the killing zone battle. And when they were exhausted and degraded and they didn't want to go and they didn't want to move and they just wanted to go to sleep, he forced them onto his net and he forced them to follow him and he forced them over the top of the ridges and down to destroy what was left of the 100 T-62s. We see this will to dominate very strongly. Another thing which I think we see in this battle is the attitude to withdrawal. Now again, I'm not advocating anything, but I do believe we can learn from the Israeli attitude to withdrawal. There is a very old brigade, 48 established brigade, in Israel called the Giv'ati Brigade. And one of its prides, it may be foolish, but one of its prides is that it has never withdrawn. Of course, this is foolish. There are moments when you have got to withdraw. But it is the attitude that I believe we can learn from. And it is in stark contrast with the attitude that was prevalent at the time that I was commanding a regiment in Germany and brigade major of 20 Brigade, which was that you traded space for time, and you had complicated withdrawal procedures, and you planned them, and you assumed them, and you practiced them. And it is in stark contrast that the Israeli attitude is, we are not going to withdraw. And of course it has characterized all their wars, Arab-Israeli wars. The final thing I would like to stress on the command and control in this battle, I think, is the preparation, which was very, very thorough. We see it in the individual knowledge of the ground amongst the commanders, and even as much as the divisional commander, Raful, who knew this ground like the back of his hand. All right, so they haven't got so much to cover as we have. But when Raful came up here, it wasn't an accident that he said to 2-6 Bravo, if you move to the right, there's a gap in the hedge and you'll see right down, because he knew the ground that well. And it is the same with Janusz, and you remember how he stressed to those battalion commanders of his who were more familiar with the Sinai than they were with the Golan, that they got to go out and recce and recce and recce. And commanders knowing the ground is an essential and is clearly, I think, demonstrated in this battle. The other aspect of that thorough preparation, of course, was Janusz's talking to the commanders down to company commander level about the onslaught they were about to receive, about how it would feel to have all those guns coming down on them, how it would feel to be battered and bruised by the artillery. And it is, I think, true that they did not suffer psychiatric shock in 7th Brigade, whereas they did everywhere else. And we've already discussed the reasons for this, but one of them is their painstaking preparation. The Israelis lost 722 killed in this battle, and they were almost all commanders of tanks. We are reminded that some of them insisted on being proud of the cupola all the time in battle, and this is very macho, but it's very dangerous. And later, as we see here, they did learn their lesson and stayed further down inside the turret. But they lost 722, almost all of them NCA or above rank, almost all of them in the Armoured Corps. In fact, the upper echelon of the Armoured Corps was decimated by this battle up in the Golan and had to be remade after the war, with infantrymen being drafted in and so on. In addition, the Israelis lost 2,500 wounded in this fighting up on the whole of the Golan. That is right through not only the battle I've described, but the subsequent counterattack. And some of those who didn't look wounded, I submit, were. One example is Janusz himself, Avigdor Janusz Ben Gol, who commanded the brigade after the war, commanded the Div district on promotion, and then went to the Kiryat, the Israeli headquarters in Tel Aviv, where he was the deputy chief of operations for the Entebbe raid. And as the green light came on in the Kiryat to say that they had taken off from Entebbe, so Janusz had a heart attack. And I believe it was, to some extent, the wounding, the damage that he received, or the stress that he received in this battle, and there are others like it. Devoted logistics throughout. I have not stressed them because we've been talking about command and control in battle. Every single Israeli tank repaired on average 3 times throughout the battle. And an acceptance by all of degradation. We see here the mantlet has gone, the machine gun has been destroyed, a lot of the optics have gone, and much of the capability of the tank has gone, but still accepting degradation and fighting with it. And so, eventually, in this battle, it was the Syrians who ran out of stock, both material and human. And the commanders on the Israeli side achieved the aim of all command and control in battle. They broke the will of the opposing commanders to fight.